All right, so we talked about the way that Madison came into the convention with a plan. Here's Madison's plan. Now, don't get freaked out by the level of complexity, because we're going to go through it. The first and most important thing to understand about the basic difference in the Virginia plan is right here. See where my cursor is going? The people. Unlike the Articles, Madison proposes a radical thing. Madison says that the new government that we are creating is not based on a confederation of the states. It's based on the direct approbation, the direct popular sovereignty of the people. Now, under the Articles government, the popular sovereignty lay with the state governments. Each of them was elected directly by their people, and then the state governments lent some of their sovereignty to the national government. Not so here. Everything comes directly from the people. So the people elect two things under the Virginia plan. The people elect a legislature for their state, and the people elect a House of Representatives, a lower house, as Madison called it. Now, to figure out how many people they were allotted in the lower house compared to the other states, the Virginia plan gave two options. The Virginia plan said that they could be represented either by how much money they paid in taxes, how wealthy they were, some measure of that. Now, the Virginia plan was vague. It was intended to be fleshed out by the convention, or simply by population. So the people would elect a certain number of representatives to the lower house directly, and the number of representatives they got compared to the other states would be dependent on either how wealthy their state was, aka how much they paid to the national treasury, or on the number of people in their state. The state could choose which of the two would advantage it. The idea here was that southern states, like Virginia, that had extremely large amounts of wealth, but not large free white populations, would choose to get their representation based on money, all that tobacco and things like that. Whereas northern states that had very large free populations would choose to have their representation based on their voting population, even though they were reasonably wealthy. Probably in the back of his mind somewhere, also, Madison thought this would provide an incentive for states like Virginia to eventually move away from slavery and towards a free economy, so they wouldn't have to substitute their wealth, which could change at any time based on economic circumstance, for their population. Okay, now they also elected a state legislature. The way the Virginia plan treated state legislatures was simply that left them alone. The state could write their own constitution, and the state could determine their constitution as they saw fit, as they pleased. The states would not have to rewrite their constitutions, which was a great fear at the time, that the states might have to rewrite their new constitutions after a new national government was created. So, those are the two things the people directly elect. That's about it for the people under the Madison Plan. They give their popular sovereignty up, they give their acclamation to two groups of people, and that's it. Work goes from there. Now, the state legislatures are free to pick some nominees. The state legislatures have a direct say in the national government. What the state legislatures do is they pick a slate of nominees for an upper house of the national government. But that slate of nominees is determined, in terms of who will actually make it, by the lower house. So let's take your class as an example. Let's say your class is the state legislature. Your class might select 3 or 4 individuals who it believes could effectively represent its interests. But the lower house, that is another group of people already elected by the people of the state, would then choose which of those individuals would actually go on to become members of the upper house. And now here's a crucial thing about the Virginia plan. In the upper house, each state would also be represented proportionally. The number of reps you got in the upper house would also be determined either by money or by free population. It was up to you. So although the state legislatures were able to select who would be in the upper house, and the lower house would select among the people chosen by the state legislatures, each state did not have an equal representation in the upper house. They were both proportional. Both of them are proportional. Now, these two upper houses, acting together, could pass national laws, all sorts of national laws. Madison's initial plan gives a huge grant of power to the upper and lower house together. They can pass basically any kind of a law they want. Now, there are a few things that he believes will be protected, things like trial by jury and stuff like that. But it's what's called plenary power, as we'll discuss later. They can do what they need to do. That brings us to the selection of a national executive to administer the laws that the lower house and upper house create. Now, Madison realized the necessity of a national executive. Even though there had not been an independent national executive under the Articles, this new government would need one. Locke believed in executive power. Adams believed in executive power. Montesquieu believed in executive power. There was no question that you'd need some kind of executive. But what's important is that the national executive here is selected by the lower house. He's a lot like a prime minister. Now, unlike a prime minister, the national executive in Madison's plan, although selected and appointed by the lower house of the legislature, as well with some input from the upper house, it's too complicated to get into here, would not necessarily be a voting member of that lower house. They would be an independent executive, selected by, but not a voting active member of the legislature. Crucial stuff. That national executive would then have a role, along with the legislature, in selecting the judges to be on the inferior and superior courts. That's another useful thing about Madison's plan. It recognizes the necessity of creating an independent judiciary branch, one that has two groups, lower and higher or constitutional courts, right? He says we're going to need a lot of different groups. Here's where we begin to get complex. The executive, or a couple of people from the executive. Madison doesn't say there will only be one executive. There's a president and a co-president, or a triumvirate. It doesn't say. Members of the executive and members of the superior court will sit on a special council. This council will be called the Council of Revision. The Council of Revision will have the authority to strike down two types of laws. The Council of Revision, you see it over here, with the executive and a member of the courts on it, can strike down laws passed by the state legislature, or it can strike down laws passed by the national legislature. Now, the national legislature can override it. There's a thing in the Virginia plan about what it takes to override the Council of Revision. But notice how different this is than the plan we end up with. The national executive has no power on his own to override. The national executive must be combined with members of the court to create a council to review laws. It's worth noting also that there's an unusual power of veto given in the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan includes a power of veto by the upper and the lower house acting together to write laws which veto state laws. The national legislature can veto state laws. This is clearly a strong and powerful central government with its authority resting firmly on the people and the great grant of power going to the lower house and very little power distributed elsewhere. Now, Madison has a lot of reasons this plan will work. He gives a bunch of speeches in support of it, and the big royal chunk of the first part of the convention is just people discussing how to implement Madison's plan. There's an endless amount of wrangling over exactly the way to determine representation in the lower house. There's an endless amount of wrangling about, well, maybe we should just set a number of representatives in the upper house. There's tons of discussion about who should be the national executive. Should there be one? Should he maybe be directed specifically by the people? There's an interesting and kind of crazy discussion over whether maybe the national executive should actually be selected by lottery from among the members of the upper house. There's all kinds of interesting stuff. But there's a lot of dissatisfaction rumbling in the background with all of this discussion, all of this figuring out how to implement the Virginia plan. And it comes to a head when William Paterson, a delegate from New Jersey, stands up and says to the whole convention, we need to just put the Virginia plan away for a minute. I'm going to propose an entirely different method. Now, here's the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan vests the people's sovereignty in only one place, the state legislatures. According to the New Jersey plan, the people will elect state legislatures. State legislatures will then select the members of Congress. This is a lot like the old Articles system, right? But the way it's not like the old Articles system is the plenary power given to the National Congress. Now, although it's not as plenary as the Madisonian plan, it's still a much wider grant. The New Jersey plan is not just a back to the Articles plan. The New Jersey plan acknowledges that you're going to need a tremendous amount more power in the national government. One power it doesn't want to give to the national government specifically, though, is the power to tax. The Treasury is maintained independently of the other powers of Congress. Now, Congress can determine, in a lot of ways, what to do in terms of getting the states to pay into the Treasury. It's allowed to impose on the states to make them pay into it, and so on. But the Treasury is mentioned explicitly as an independent thing in the New Jersey plan. Just like the executive here is directly appointed from the unicameral Congress and does not have a unity with the armed forces like he does in the Virginia plan. The armed forces are separate from and directed partially by the states instead of directly by the executive himself. The executive would not be the commander-in-chief in this case, had we ended up adopting. The Superior Court, in this case, can only veto the laws of Congress. It can't veto the state laws. So I don't want to spend too long on the New Jersey plan, but it's really worth noting that the New Jersey plan scares the bejesus out of Hamilton and Madison and Washington and many of the other strong nationalists. Not because they think it'll pass. They don't think it will pass. They're quite sure that they're going to maintain control over the convention, but because they fear that it's going to come back and it's going to weaken the ideal structure that they've set up in the Virginia plan. They're very worried about it. There's an impassioned speech at one point about why the upper house has to remain proportional during the discussion over a unicameral Congress, during which someone actually suggests, well, fine, if you want a representative upper house, why don't we just take apart the states and rebuild the states so that each state has the same population? How would you like that, Pennsylvania? It gets heated. This whole thing gets very heated. I don't have time to quote at length from the debates for you, but it's really worth noting. These are passionate people stuck in a hot hall in Philadelphia with each other for 6 to 8 hours. They are not happy campers about this stuff, and this is a complicated debate that they're having. Let's talk about the main compromises. The first set of compromises that occurs during the convention are the slavery compromises. And don't listen to anybody who tells you that the biggest, most important issue at the convention was big states and small states. Madison himself said on the floor of the convention that the issue of slave states and non-slave states was or would be just as important as the issue of big and small or wealthy and poor. So this is important. They just can't talk about it as openly. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is one of the most infamous in the Constitution. And it's really worth discussing how it comes about, because there are a lot of misconceptions about the Three-Fifths Compromise. Probably the most important misconception is that it's about whether African American slaves are people or not. It's not. It's not about whether they're people. It elides the issue of whether they're people or not. It doesn't even think about it. Now remember how under the Virginia plan you could choose as a state to represent yourself based on wealth or on population? Well, one of the things that they have an argument about is whether slaves are wealth, and if they are, whether they should not count as population, and so on. It goes back and forth about this. But if you choose a proportional thing, can you count slaves at all, or are slaves purely a measure of property? What they end up deciding is that because there was this bill way back in the Articles Congress, a bill where they were determining how much each state had to pay to the Articles Congress, what that bill back in the Articles Congress said was that all workers, so the population, was a good way to determine how much the state was capable of paying. And for the purposes of the Articles Congress, each African American slave in a state would count for 3/5 of a free worker. The idea was they were less productive, but they should still count towards the tax obligation of a state. Well, they just imported that number from the Articles bill that had happened, 6 years previously. They said, well, if 3/5 made sense in terms of determining the productivity of the workers for a tax obligation, we can adopt 3/5 as the amount that a slave can count for proportional representation in the lower house of the legislature. This was a hard-fought compromise. There were a lot of people in the North who felt that, well, if your African American slaves were going to count for 3/5 of their value for a proportional representation by population, why not count my house at 3/5 of its value? Why not count all my ships at 3/5 of their value? There's a really great quote by Gouverneur Morris about this very topic. If you go and look on the class website, I've got it there in my selections from the debates. But this is only the representation, not the taxation. And it's going to give the South a tremendous advantage in the lower house, at least for a while. Because remember that in states like Virginia, 40 to 60% of the population was African American. So if they had a proportional representation without a 3/5 compromise, they would be deeply disadvantaged. Now, the next two compromises are a little less well known, but are important. The first is the importation compromise. Now, many of the slave states were still very active slave traders. They bought them, they sold them, they found ways to sell them to Caribbean colonies or buy them from Caribbean colonies. They needed to continue importing them in order to expand their agricultural industries. Remember, like Georgia is still the frontier at this point, right? So they very much feared that anything that interfered with the slave trade would permanently destroy their economies. And even though there was not much support for abolition of slavery as an institution, there was widespread support for an end to the slave trade. They were deeply worried that if you gave the Congress the power to regulate commerce in any way, one of the first bills that would pass would be a bill abolishing the slave trade. Let me walk you through this, because it's crucial to understanding the whole Constitution, right? The right of property is sacred in a way. It's one of Locke's 3 basic rights. They're forming a government that will protect and safeguard property. And slaves themselves are property, first of all. There's also a deep-seated racial discomfort among the framers. They don't understand how to handle African Americans. They know that there's a socially divisive issue here. That's a problem. So those two things make abolition difficult. Slaves are property, and we can't abrogate the right to property. Also, race is something we're not comfortable with discussing, and we don't know how to deal with. And basically, we're a bunch of racists in the 17th century, right? The 18th century. But abolition of the slave trade is easy to discuss. It's clear to them that the slave trade is vicious, and it degrades people, and it results in mass death and rape, and all kinds of other things. So they have no worry about abolishing the slave trade. Thus, the southern states fear that one of the first bills to pass as soon as the new Congress gets together will be abolition of the slave trade, and they fear that will strangle their economy. And so they agree that they can stop Congress from ever changing anything about the slave trade for 20 years. A 20-year protection of the slave trade is built into the Constitution. And one of the reasons they think this is okay is because ultimately they're either optimists, like Madison, and they think, oh, slavery will be dead in 20 or 30 years. We won't need to have importation. We can stop it. Or they're cynical, like the Pinckneys, and they think, well, if we don't stop it for 20 years, it will become so important to our economy, and there will be so many slave states that they won't want to stop it in 20 years. So you can take your pick of the idealism or the cynicism. But certainly they wrote this protection of the slave trade right into the Constitution in order to keep the southern states on board. The southern states threatened to walk out of the convention if they did not write this in, and yet still gave Congress the power to regulate commerce. Important stuff. Finally, there's kind of a silence compromise. The Constitution doesn't say much about slavery. The word slave is never used anywhere in the document. There are other persons. There are such persons as a state shall feel free to import, and things like that. But It doesn't take any moral or social position. There's no abolition message. The 20-year compromise, the importation compromise, never implies in any way that Congress should pass such a bill in 20 years. The Three-Fifths Compromise never implies in any way that it's creating something that will support or attack slavery in its political or social realm. So it's a silent document on slavery. The next set of compromises was honestly one that the framers thought was much more important and would take up a lot more of their time. While we pay a lot of attention as historians to the slavery debates because of how deeply important those would be to the social and economic history of our country in the antebellum era a few years down the road, these issues I'm about to talk about, the structure of the legislative and the powers of the legislative and the powers of the executive, were the ones that really grabbed, that really were important to the framers. They spent the vast share of their time at the Constitutional Convention on these discussions. So let's talk about them. They first had to decide whether they were going to go unicameral or bicameral, right? This is one of the big ways in which the New Jersey and Virginia plans were different. One was a bicameral, one was a unicameral system. Most of the states had a bicameral system. Now, some didn't. Pennsylvania was unique in that Pennsylvania had a unicameral system at the time. And in fact, in the modern United States, we do have one state that still has a unicameral system. But most states are bicameral. Madison has strong theoretical support for a bicameral system. In his gigantic book of histories, he goes out and he lays out all of the different confederations and republics in history and discusses how the ones that have a bicameral system end up creating wiser laws and create laws more slowly. He's got a whole theoretical structure for why bicameralism is superior that the New Jersey plan doesn't have. Even its most passionate representatives of a unicameralism can't really stand up to Madison's arguments about bicameralism. So it seems pretty clear that we're going to end up with a bicameral legislature. But remember that in the Virginia plan, both branches of this bicameral legislature were proportional. So that's where we're going to get a compromise. Just remember that. Also, we have to ask ourselves, do we want these to be big or small branches, right? Do we want large numbers of representatives, or do we want a very few representatives? This, again, is a kind of an important argument. They have a long debate about whether you want a small number of highly elite, very wise people deliberating over bills. Madison likes the idea of extensive deliberation, of a few elite, wise people thinking and taking the time and discussing and working out laws, whereas other extremely ardent Democrats like Wilson of Pennsylvania really believe that what's most important is getting the voice of the people. And therefore you need a lot of representatives, because if you have a lot of representatives, then you would be able to have elections by smaller groups of people, smaller districts. There were two practical considerations here, too, that you see in the outline here. First of all, there weren't enough people in the Articles Congress. Each state sent like 2 people. If they were lucky. Sometimes they sent 7, but usually that was just New York, since they were in New York most of the time. There weren't enough people to get anything done. They couldn't create subcommittees. They couldn't create committees. They couldn't send special envoys or representatives to discuss problems. They didn't get a lot done because of a delegation problem. So you needed at least a certain minimum number of representatives so that you could form committees, so that you could write bills. Second, though, they realized there would be a coordination problem. If you had too many representatives, you had to wait for them all to get there, and in the 1700s, waiting for them all to get there when they have to come across muddy dirt roads, on horses, through cities that were full of plagues, like Philadelphia was at the time, actually. They knew that that could be a problem. So this is something they're going to have to compromise about. And in the end, they compromised by creating a small house, that is the Senate, and a large house, that is the House of Representatives. They also have to ask themselves, what are these legislative structures? What are they going to be like? Are they going to be deliberative, or are they going to be strongly representative? Are they going to sway with the will of the people, or are they going to sit back and take a view of long-term national interests? Very different visions of the reactionary, the representative body, and the deliberative body. And again, this is a much bigger discussion for the framers than a lot of the other ones that we typically talk about, like big state, small state, things like that. They really are not sure which one they want. Do they want something that's much more like state legislatures? Most state legislatures at this time had a 1-year term. Most state legislatures at this time had recall provisions that said that if you didn't like what your representative was doing, you could take him out and elect a new representative. Most state legislatures at this time had rotation in office provisions that meant no one could hold the office of representative for more than a year or two. They couldn't hold multiple consecutive terms. All of this was to make the bodies more fluid, more reactionary to the will of their representatives. But at the same time, the guys who were there in Philadelphia were Enlightenment individuals. And as Enlightenment individuals, they believed in a natural aristocracy of intelligent, well-meaning, dedicated men possessing civic virtue and a belief in their communities who would be able to sit back and discuss the nature of problems. Finally, there came a point in the discussion where they thought about maybe having a house, one which could represent the interests of the nation, and then one which represented more closely the interests of the states. By the interests of the nation, we mean the people as a whole. And by the states, we mean the individual state legislatures. And so we'll leave it here, but it's worth noting that once you get the compromise about the House and Senate, it maps neatly onto this, right? The Senate becomes more deliberative, more aristocratic, more federal, right, about the national interest, while the House becomes more reactive, more in tune with the will of its constituents, smaller numbers of constituents for each member. It's going to attract, they think, the natural aristocracy because of the way it's appointed by state legislatures, and it's going to be looking at the long-term interests of the nation. That's why it's given powers over treaties and things like that. So this character of the bodies question is deeply important. Finally, there's this question of what's called mutual dependencies, and I have this in blue because it's one that's a little bit abstract, but it's kind of interesting to ask, what kind of power should they share? Should they be dependent on each other in some way? Remember that, for example, in the original Virginia plan, the upper house was going to be completely dependent on the lower house. They would elect its members. And the upper house would be dependent on the state legislatures, where the state legislatures were able to nominate the people who could be elected by the lower house for the upper house. Is one actually higher than the other? Should one have greater social status? Now, no one except Hamilton at the convention has the temerity to mention anything about, let's say, titles of nobility. But it's worth noting that there is a discussion about whether they should be dependent on some principle, whether that's a principle of natural aristocracy, whether that should be a principle of nomination or dependency by election, whether they should in some way rely on one another for a grant of power. Very interesting. And it comes out finally in the taxation power, which we'll discuss. Now, once you get the structure of the legislature down, you have to decide what particular powers to give it, right? This is a very difficult discussion, probably more difficult than determining the structure of the legislature. And I'm going to try and move a little faster here so you're not stuck forever. They needed to decide whether to give a plenary power, a power to do the things that it needs to do, to the Congress, or whether to give it a limited and specific power set. Now, at the time, most governments, state governments, the Parliament of England, had plenary powers, the power to do what was needed and what was appropriate. That was what they were used to. But a lot of the people from smaller states, a lot of the people who were worried about giving too large a grant of power to Congress for fear that it would be taken over by a specific faction, as we'll talk about when we read the Federalist Papers, were worried about giving a full plenary power. And so when we read the Constitution, we'll really see this in Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 9, and Article 1, Section 10, where they work out a balance whereby, yes, the powers are enumerated and limited, but but it has clauses like necessary and proper and the Commerce Clause, which are quite broad. So while the powers are both limited and enumerated, and it's worth noting those are different things. Limits are things you can't do. Enumerated is a list of things you can do. While the powers they choose are both limited and enumerated, so definitely not plenary powers, there are two very broad clauses that begin to look plenary later on. There are also some inherent powers, right, that the legislature is always going to have. Things like the power to go and investigate, things like the power to form committees. And there's a long discussion about which powers are inherent to the legislature. For example, is the power to tax inherent to the legislature, or does the power to tax need to be written in? Is the power to sign treaties inherent to the legislature? It goes on and on and on. But these are what are considered the basic duties of a legislature. To give you two really standout examples of this, the power to investigate, so the power to summon people to come and talk to the Congress, that's considered to be inherent. It doesn't even have to be discussed or written in any depth. And the power to organize itself are both considered important and inherent. And then there are a few, right? They fight about whether they can establish armed forces and what kind. Because remember that under the Articles system, the states had maintained a militia. That militia could then be called into national service. So should we have an independent national government? Maybe. Whether they could declare war, when they could declare war, on whom could they declare war. Once a war was declared, who was in charge of the fighting? The Continental Congress had proven that it was really not easy to have the Congress fight a war. If not, didn't work out very well. But it did get done. We did win. So it was a very real fight over in whom to invest the power of continuing the war and of choosing how and when to continue the fighting of a war. Whether it should assume debt, or whether it should be able to take on new debt, or whether only states should be able to help it decide to take on debt. Who and when and how it should be able to tax. All of these things were discussions that the framers had to have at the convention about what kind of powers to give Congress, even at the same time as they were discussing its structures. Whew. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about the executive and the judicial powers.